Please join me in giving Larry Reed a warm Wichita welcome.
Thank you, John. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and a special thanks to AFP Kansas and so many friends who are here, I know, representing the Bastiat Society or the Pachyderm Club and other groups that I've had the pleasure to interact with here over the years. Boy, you know you're traveling too much when the flight attendants start to call you by name. But it was a great drive coming from Kansas City yesterday to Lawrence and then Lawrence to here. But I was just notified that I'm already diamond on Delta for next year, and it's only early April. And it's true that I've had flight attendants actually say things like, "Oh, aren't you Mr. Reed?" or "Not you again." Or there's an old story. This didn't happen to me, but I've heard it told of someone else that a flight attendant was going through first class taking dinner orders. And she came to one man and said, "Sir, will you be having dinner?" And he said, "What are my choices?" And she said, "Yes or no." And speaking of travel, coincidentally, I'm talking about Rome with you today. And on Saturday, I'm going to Italy for a vacation that I've been planning for some time, just for a week. And it gives me an opportunity, just thinking of it, to give a plug to a book. How many here, by chance, have read the recent book that's been out for just under a year called Beneath a Scarlet Sky? Anybody? Oh, well, let me give it an extra big plug then. On Amazon, it's been an Amazon bestseller, and it has something like 18,000 reviews, and the average is 5 stars. That's how good it is. And about 3 months ago, an old friend of mine contacted me and said, "Larry, you got to get this book, Beneath a Scarlet Sky. It's fantastic, and it's based on a true story." And so I did, and she was right. I couldn't put it down. And one of the reasons in a few days I'm going to Italy is to meet the man, now 92, about whom the book was written. His name is Pino Lella, and he was, at the age of 17, an Italian resistance fighter from 1943 to 45 in northern Italy near Milan. And the book tells the story of what he did and why he did it and why it was so important. He helped more than 100 people, Jewish people, across the Alps into safety in Switzerland. This is when he's 17, no less. And then through a long confluence of extraordinary events, he becomes a spy for the Allies at age 18 and gets a job as the driver for the number 2 Nazi general in all of Italy. And so the balance of about the second half of the book is all about what he saw as he drove this driver around to meetings with Mussolini, for instance, and so forth, until he finally finds the opportunity to turn the guy in. But in any event, it's a remarkable story, and I posted about the book on Facebook. What a testimony here to the power of social media. And I simply said, this is a great book, you all ought to read it. And a Facebook friend from Montana left a comment. She said, "The author lives right here in Bozeman." And I said, "Hey, can you possibly open a door? I'd like to ask him if he can open a door to meet Mr. Lella in Italy when I'm there in April." And so she did, and the author replied, "I'll put you in touch with Pino's son, who lives in Groveland, California." And so he did, and we've become great friends in the last month or two. And so April 12 is the day that I'll get to meet Mr. Lella himself, who's now 92 and speaks great English apparently, and is quite vigorous. So another hero in our midst, the kind of people that I love to talk about, love to meet, and to recommend that others get to know. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the ancient civilization of Rome and the lessons that we can draw from it. And of course, that raises a question. Well, this is 2,000-year-old information. What value might it have to us today? You've all heard the great words of the philosopher George Santayana, that those who, how did he put it? Those who ignore history are condemned to repeat it. And that's an allusion to the fact that no matter how far back you go, there are lessons that are eternal about the experiences of other people. And so much of what happens in the world today, the more you know history, you begin to see this, so much of what happens today has echoes in the past. So little that seems to be new really is new. That some of the good things that we do have been done before, and sadly, many of the bad things we do have echoes from the past. When you talk about ancient Rome, you're really looking at 1,000 years of history, almost on the nose. From the rise of the Roman Republic in 509 BC to the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, you have almost exactly 1,000 years. And that's divided almost evenly between 500 years as a republic and 500 years as an imperial autocracy or dictatorship, the empire. There are a lot of lessons to be drawn from how Rome went from a relatively free republic to a dictatorship in its last 500 years, and I'd like to dwell on some of that today. And right in the middle of those two periods, almost exactly, is, of course, the birth of Christ. That happens just a matter of decades after the fall of the republic and early into the period of the empire. Well, Roman history is, I think, absolutely fascinating. I enjoy it as much as I do the history of any other country, any other civilization in the past. And we know from the records that Rome achieved heights of greatness, heights of individual liberty that no civilization before had achieved. And we also know that it was all lost, and that nothing quite like it would emerge again for literally centuries. I want to give you some of the highlights of Rome's great achievements before I tell you how they came about and how they were lost. In the year 70 AD, this is about 100 years after the end of the Republic and into the Empire period, there were 1 million people in Rome. That was about the height of population in ancient Rome, 1 million. Not until London in the 19th century would any city on the planet even approach that size. Guess how many people were in Rome just a few centuries in the Middle Ages after that peak of 1 million in 70 AD? Around 1,300, which would be almost 1,300 years later. How many people do you think were in Rome? 17,000. Think of that. That is civilizational collapse, isn't it? One of the most remarkable in all of history. When Vespasian, the emperor, started building the Colosseum in 70 AD, Rome was 10 times the size that it was when Napoleon invaded it almost 18 centuries later. Colosseum had 45,000 seats and standing room for another 20,000. In 100 AD, you could travel from Egypt to France on paved roads with only one currency and one passport in your pocket. Aqueducts reached 70 miles from the countryside into the city of Rome, bringing fresh water, more fresh water per person than at any time in Rome until the 1950s. When Rome was born as a republic, it was 509 BC. And like America, it was born in revolt against tyranny, revolt against monarchy in particular. With us, of course, it was the British. With the Romans, it was kings ruling on behalf of the Etruscans, the civilization immediately to the north of the region of Rome. Romans had had enough at that point of one man or strong man rule, and they decided we're not going to repeat that mistake. And in 509 BC, they did something absolutely remarkable. They created a republic. They said no more concentration of power in the hands of a single person. We're going to create two people who will have power at the top. We'll call them consuls. They will only serve 1 year. That might be one of the earliest introductions of term limits in history. 1 year for the two guys at the top, and so as to further disperse power, we're going to allow the decisions of one to overrule those of the other. So they have to come together before they can really do anything. And then they can only do it for a year, and then they have to step down. At about the same time, they created the fabled Roman Senate, which they would have all the way up until Rome was conquered in 476 AD. Even in the 500 years of the dictatorship, they kept, at least in name, the Roman Senate, though it had nothing more than rubber stamp authority at that point. But they created the Senate shortly after the birth of the Republic in 509 BC. It was made up of representatives of the more noble families who could trace their lineage back to Romulus and Remus, the legendary founders of Rome a couple hundred years before. But at the same time, it also created something that doesn't get as much attention in our history books, but they created, in addition to the Senate, popular assemblies that those of voting age and qualification could select. And increasingly, as the period of the Republic continues, power will center on the popularly elected assemblies. So it isn't just a matter of noble families ruling ancient Rome with the rest of society having no say. Most people in ancient Rome had increasing say in how the nation was run after the creation of those assemblies. They also had early on, such institutions that we celebrate today and think that are so uniquely American, as habeas corpus, separation of powers, term limits. They had a constitution, by the way, but like the British to this day, it was not a written one, but it was firmly rooted in things like custom and precedent and consensus, to the point where in the first few centuries, Romans were expected to revolt if they sensed that there was any man who was striving to overrule the Constitution, to jeopardize it in any way and seek power for himself. How many have seen the Monty Python movie? I think it's The Life of Brian, but I'm not sure. But it's the one that's centered in Roman Palestine. There's a scene there which reminds us, I think, of just how much the ancient Roman Republic achieved over its 500 years. John Cleese, the comedian, has assembled a group of 20 or 30 disgruntled Palestinians, and they're trying to get rid of Roman rule. And Cleese is trying to whip them up to be fervent in their passion against the Romans. And he says at one point, "After all, what have the Romans ever done for us?" And there's a pause, and a voice in the background says, "Aqueducts." And then Cleese says, "Well, okay, other than aqueducts, what have the Romans ever done for us?" And then there's another voice that says, "Education." Another voice says sanitation. Another says public safety. Another one says roads. Another one's, just on down the list. And finally, Cleese says, "Okay, other than aqueducts, roads, education, sanitation, public safety, what have the Romans ever done for us?" It's a great tongue-in-cheek way of saying, wow, they really accomplished a lot, even with all of their shortcomings and all of their increasing sins, I might add, as the Republic wore on. Romans achieved these things, great heights of individual enterprise and initiative and outreach, essentially influencing virtually every corner of the Mediterranean and a bit beyond. Largely because during the period of the Republic, they stressed such things as limited government, property rights. Now, not everybody had them, and they did have slavery. And from a liberty standpoint, that's always objectionable. Roman society, though freer than any that came before it, perhaps, and certainly over a territory as extensive as it was not perfect. But they carried freedom further than any previous society on such a large scale. So it's not surprising to those of us who believe in liberty that people who muster the courage and integrity to respect the lives and the property and the associations and the contracts of other people will themselves flourish. And the Romans became, in fact, the very center of the world's wealth before the Republic saw its last days. But the big question for us is, why did they lose it all? How did that happen? Why did Rome, as a great and free civilization, ultimately die? And what are the lessons from that? I want to tell you right up front that I think there are three main reasons for the decline and fall of the Republic and of Rome as a free and prosperous society. Three reasons. Anything else, I think, is pales in comparison to the importance of these three reasons. One is costly foreign overreach in the form of wars that at first, in fact, there's a great book called Empires of Trust by Thomas Madden that goes into this in some detail. He points out that the Romans didn't start out with the idea of creating an empire. That in fact their early interventions were often in the form of assisting others who were beleaguered because of foreign intervention. The Greeks, more than once, they rescued the Greeks. And he talks about the occasion when the Greeks were under pressure from the Persians, and the Romans sent troops and effectively kicked the Persians out. And the Greeks all thought, well, now we're conquered by these people from the West, and so they'll probably now tell us what to do. And they were shocked when the Romans said, okay, you're free now, we're going home. It was later in the empire that Romans started to discover, hey, maybe it's not so bad to go grab a chunk of somebody else's property. But that was not customary in the early days. The more expensive foreign adventures for reasons other that were not particularly noble came much later. And I would argue that happened largely because of what power does to people. The more powerful people become at home, the more they feel they can spread their wings and spread their power by bloodying the noses of people from beyond their borders. So costly wars and foreign adventure and the tremendous expense to keep those things going contributed mightily to the decline of the Republic for multiple reasons, not just the cost, but also the fact that it would celebrate generals and the people who fought under them, so that over time, a lot of Romans, their sense of loyalty to the society at large was subordinated to their loyalty to the general who brought back the booty and redistributed it to them. And so loyalty to society took increasingly a back seat to loyalty to the guy who wielded power because he commanded armies. A second reason for the decline of the Republic was the rise of the welfare state, the rise of the Roman welfare state. And I'll give you some examples of that in a moment. In the early few centuries of ancient Rome, even schooling was regarded as a personal obligation, and it was done at home. You didn't see government schools in ancient Rome, in the Republic anyway, until very late in the Republic. And even then, they were introduced more to serve the power, the interests of those in power than they were to help people get education. They were getting it fine at home. The Greeks often turned their noses up at the Romans on this issue. They had government schools early on, and there are various allusions in history to Greeks looking upon the Romans as, what's wrong with them? Why don't they send their children to community schools funded by all of us instead of educating their kids at home? I think, in fact, that was a great strength. It was a source of the character that defined early Rome. It was in the home that Romans were taught the importance of things like integrity, character, truthfulness, speaking truth to power, fealty to the Constitution, and so forth. And the third reason for Rome's decline was the compromise of constitutional norms to serve the ends of the first two. Okay, so the first one, costly foreign adventures. The second one was the welfare state. And the third reason is the compromise of constitutional norms, sort of looking askance at the Constitution, doing things because they were convenient, not because they were right or proper, in order to serve the welfare state or to help the state win its next foreign adventure. The old Constitution that was so strong in the hearts and minds of Romans for several hundred years, late in the Republic you begin to see people don't care about it so much anymore. The commitment to term limits, for instance, is increasingly compromised. You had one guy named Marius, who I told you that the consulship was to be held for 1 year, and that's it. They didn't want anybody to have power at the top for any longer than that. Well, he lived around 100 BC, 30 years or so either side of that, and he was the first one to serve in the consulship position for 7 terms. And each time, I got a little story with each one. Each time it basically came down to, I'm really good, and so I'm indispensable. You need me for another year. And many of the people who thought at first, well, we don't do that here, increasingly thought, well, you know, he did some good things. He got me something anyway, so yeah, it'd be nice to have him back for another year. And he ended up getting elected to 7 unprecedented terms as consul. That was against the Constitution. But by that late date in the empire, or in the Republic, I should say, the Constitution meant less and less to people. There were compromises all over the place. There used to be a rule in the assembly that one tribune could hold up legislation and prevent it from being passed, because now you might say, well, that's pretty far out. But nonetheless, it held Rome together for a long time. And the sense was, look, if the government's going to do something, we better have unanimous support in the popular assembly, at least at a certain level of law and higher. But the not emperor, but tribune Tiberius Gracchus, was the first to organize the deposition or removal of another tribune simply because he held out and wouldn't go along with the majority. That may sound like a little thing about a matter that was kind of extreme to begin with, but that's typical in the late Roman Republic. The Constitution is seen increasingly as an obstacle by men of power who wanted more of it. And if the Constitution said you can't do that, or you can't do it this year, or whatever, they've increasingly found ways to get around it and ignore it. It is. I really don't have to tell you much about the parallels with today. You can see them, can't you, rather plainly. The most climactic period of the entire 500-year Roman Republic was the last 100 years, from roughly the 140s BC to 43 BC, 100 years. Why is that so climactic? And what happened in the 140s to really accelerate the decline? The year 146 is especially important because it was the year that Rome finally vanquished Carthage. It fought 3 wars, the Punic Wars against Carthage, which was an empire in northern Africa. And finally, in 146 BC, Carthage was thoroughly and finally defeated. And in the same year, the Romans crushed and basically liquidated Corinth in Greece, which had revolted against Roman influence. So you had wars at 2 ends of the Republic at that point. And you had victories at both ends. And you had generals coming back and being celebrated as great Roman heroes who themselves didn't have the integrity to say, thank you, now I'm going back to the farm. In each case, these successful generals in those conflicts sought further political power, and they and their followers gained it over the next 50 or so years. I want to focus now on one particular man who really in many ways defines the last half century of the Roman Republic. And in fact, it's his death that I would submit to you might best be seen as the year, or the year of his death is the year that you could say that's when the Roman Republic ended. His name was Marcus Tullius Cicero. How many have heard of Cicero? Almost everybody. The greatest, I think, of all the Romans. of all the 1,000 years of ancient Roman history. Certainly regarded widely as the greatest of all Roman orators. He was a senator, and an unlikely one because he came from the so-called equestrian order, families who were more involved in merchant affairs, in commerce, than connected with any nobility. Cicero was a remarkable man. You know that we know more from firsthand evidence, from his actual letters and speeches. We know more about him and from him than we know about or from any other person who lived before the year 1000 AD. That's how extensive the records are left behind by Cicero. A vast quantity of letters, records from his time in the Senate, and so forth. He was the man more than anybody else who introduced an appreciation in Rome of the best of Greek literature and history. When Gutenberg invented the printing press in the 1450s, long after 1,000 years, in fact, after Rome itself had fallen, you may know that the first thing he printed on it was the Bible. But the second thing he printed was by Cicero, a work called De Officiis, in which he talks about, among other things, the central importance of a limited government and its proper function as a defender of the private property of the people. He bequeathed a vast literature that became very important to the Western thought about such things as the proper role of government and the importance of individual liberty. America's founders, and I dare say this is probably to a person, knew who Cicero was and had read Cicero extensively. And it was the lessons that they learned from him and from others of that time period that our founders intended to put in place so that America wouldn't make the same mistakes that the ancient republic did. Well, Cicero was born in a town called Arpinum, about 70 miles southeast of Rome itself, in 106 BC. Now keep in mind, this is halfway through that final century of the Roman Republic. It's sort of hanging on by a thread. You've got the rise of the welfare state, of the assemblies offering goodies at public expense, the old ways of thinking of the government as the agent of protection, not of provision of daily life, had given way to the latter, as more and more Romans were on the grain dole, getting grain free from the government, subsidized or price controlled, and increasingly absolutely free from the government. Politicians winning election by offering people more of it, outbidding their competitors by saying, if I'm elected, I'll get you more than he'll get you. Does that sound familiar? So Cicero, as he grows up, he sees, and he's a student of history, so he knows it wasn't always this way. He realizes, wow, my civilization is crumbling all around me. People don't seem to care about the old rules and the old constitutional norms. We're in danger here. So from his 20s, he makes it apparent that he's very aware and very concerned about the slide towards tyranny in the Roman Republic. He sees the conflict and the strife that the welfare state and these constant foreign adventures have produced, and is very concerned about what that means for the future of liberty in Rome. He makes his name early as a fantastic lawyer. In his early 20s, he takes on a case that gives him the reputation of a young man courageous enough to speak truth to power at great risk to himself. He defends a man who was accused of murdering his father. And he does, as he will always do for the rest of his life, incredible research into the case to try to see if it's true and make the best case that he can for the man's innocence. And he uncovers evidence that suggests that this man who is accused not only didn't do it, but that the real orders to kill the father apparently came from the highest echelons of the Roman Republic. For a young man just starting out in life to make such a statement and begin to produce some of the evidence, this took a lot of courage. But he was successful in the sense that the man was acquitted. And ordinary Romans came to respect this guy. He was hated by some of those in power. But ordinary Romans said, wow, here's a guy who really is committed to truth. And he found out some stuff that people didn't think was there, and he saved an innocent man's life. 10 years later, in the courtroom, he'll make a further name for himself, but not as a defender, but as a prosecutor, when he took off after a very powerful provincial governor by the name of Verus. And in fact, his arguments against Verus are read to this day in many law schools under the Latin title In Verum. And what he discovers is that this guy Verus is in fact guilty of abusing many of the people in the province he governed, of enormous corruption, of raking in tax revenues and putting them in his personal pocket. It takes a man of courage to try to make this case against this powerful man, because he had friends in the highest echelons of the Roman Republic. Verus sees the handwriting on the wall before the trial is over and actually flees, later is apprehended, and Cicero wins another case. Thereafter, he runs for political office and gets elected. He never loses an election. He got elected to every significant post: questor, aedile, praetor, and ultimately to the top position of consul in the ancient Roman Republic. We don't know much about the other guy who was elected consul the same year, Antonius Hybrida, largely because Cicero just outshines him in every way. Here he is now at the peak of his political career, holding the top office only in his 40s, I believe, in Rome. And within weeks, he begins to hear rumors that a powerful senator, anyone know his name? No, Caesar will soon make his appearance, but that a powerful senator is conniving behind the scenes to snuff out the Republic, gathering an army and making plans to invade Rome with that army, kill the two consuls, many members of the Senate, and declare himself a dictator. That man's name was Catiline. And Cicero, at first, plays his cards close to his vest. If he's going to make a case against Catiline, he wants his ducks in a row. He wants to get all the evidence that he can. And is he ever good at it? Ultimately, he goes before the Senate with Catiline present, who doesn't realize what's about to hit him. And Cicero dumps the evidence before the Senate of what this one man is attempting to do, raising the specter of the end of this 400-plus-year-old republic at the hands of one of its highest leaders. Before Cicero is finished, Catiline leaves the Senate, organizes his army, and begins his march on Rome. The Senate gives Cicero absolute power. Do whatever it takes, is their request, to stop this mortal threat to the Roman Republic. Cicero marshals the Republic's army, does battle with Catiline, and defeats him. And at that point, the Roman Senate bestows the honorary title upon him of Father of the Country. He has saved the Republic. What would most people do you think, upon being given total power? Yeah, most people would say, well, I can't retire from this, and I've got good ideas in mind, and I think I'll just stick around for a while. Cicero doesn't. He immediately returns it. When his term is up at the end of the year, he retires as the law requires. And in the course of doing that, he reminds me a lot of Cincinnatus, the fabled Roman who dropped his plow, went to fight against a foreign invader, and when the job was done, he went back to his farm. It reminds me of George Washington, whom George III once said was the greatest man of his day, simply because he had total power within his grasp and declined it. And essentially, that's what Cicero did. He used it to do the job he was tasked to do and gave it up. The Republic simply meant too much to him to even concentrate power in his own hands. So he retires to his villa with the idea of, I'm just going to write for the rest of my life. I'm done with politics. But politics will not leave Cicero alone. Another threat to the Republic appears in the form of the man whose name was just mentioned, Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar had been very successful in Gaul and in Cisalpine Gaul, northwestern Italy, and now decides he's going to make a move on Rome itself. And of course, it's all because we're going to end the chaos of all the civil strife that the welfare warfare state has created. I'll be in charge, and I'll knock heads together, bring order out of the chaos. And of course, when he crosses the Rubicon, that famous phrase, he effectively has said, I'm going to declare war on Rome and seize power. The Roman Senate, by the time he gets there, the Roman Senate decides, hey, this guy is pretty powerful, let's make him emperor for life. Guess how long that lasts? 1 month. Until Caesar, of course, is assassinated on the Ides of March, 44 BC. Now, who killed him? Brutus and some other senators whose objective was to restore the Republic. They saw, hey, the hour is late. This guy's coming in. He's going to wipe away what freedoms are left of this fading republic, and we just can't have that. So they took the ultimate measure. And for a moment after Caesar's death, you might say maybe the republic could come back to life if people saw the danger of the concentration of power that they had allowed in the hands of one top man, so un-Roman in just the previous few years. Maybe there was a chance for the republic to be revived. But a man named Mark Antony decided, I'm going to inherit Caesar's power, and I'll be the new dictator. And that's when Cicero comes out of retirement. He goes before the Senate and delivers a series of 14 speeches known to this day as the Philippics. You can read them all, in which he denounces Mark Antony, defends the liberties of the old republic, decries Mark Antony as a tyrant in waiting, implores the Roman people to prevent this from happening, to think about their past and the glories of the freedoms that they enjoyed for several centuries. Mark Antony declares Cicero an enemy of the state and dispatches an assassin to take him out. And it's in December of 43 BC when that assassin finds his mark and Cicero is killed. Historians to this day debate, well, when was the end of the Roman Republic? Was it when Caesar was declared the emperor? Was it maybe later after Octavian defeated Mark Antony and became the first of the emperors? I think it was when Cicero was killed. And the reason is there was no one else. No one else left after December 43 BC who had the courage or the integrity to speak truth to power and to defend the old virtues of the Roman Republic. So I think it died with him. But if I had an hour to go back in history, and in fact, this is a great exercise. Think about this sometime on your own. If you could pick, say, 10 people in history and go back and spend an hour with each of them, just you and that other person, who would you pick? Who you pick might say a lot about you. But I know on my list, Cicero would be one of them, because this great man not only defended what he knew to be right, but he bequeathed us such a vast literature in defense of the very values that we in America regard as so special to us. Well, with the end of the Republic, we don't have yet the end of Rome itself. We have the transformation of it from a free republic to an increasingly tyrannical dictatorship. And I just want to say a few quick words about that. I want to cover that 500 years in about 2 minutes and then give you time for questions. But things, I suppose you could say at any given time there might have been a mental reawakening, a spiritual reawakening, and Romans could have said, hey, let's get rid of this budding empire and go back to the old days, but it never happened. So maybe that's a lesson for us, that once you lose your freedom, it's very hard to get it back. And we have maybe not the excuses the Romans did, to not fight to restore our lost liberties. I mean, we know from their experience, they had little experience to look back onto, but we have theirs to learn from. But we know that Rome's decline was rather set in stone, you might say, for the next 500 years. There were high points, but they didn't last very long. In 33 AD, okay, this is into maybe the fourth or fifth of the emperors in the empire, or maybe third or fourth. There was a financial crisis that gripped ancient Rome, and the government responded with a massive infusion of zero-interest credit. Does that ring a bell? Zero-interest credit in 33 AD to stem the financial panic. Many of the businesses that were directly stimulated by this infusion of cheap money will later become the object of scorn, and businesses that were once respected and emulated become objects of ridicule and eventual nationalization. In the year 91 AD, the Emperor Domitian, and this will sound like FDR in the 1930s, Emperor Domitian wants to help out the wine producers. And so he orders the destruction of half of the vineyards in the provinces in order to raise the price of wine. In the year 270 AD, jumping ahead quite a ways, the Emperor Aurelian decides to really give the welfare state a big boost. By this point, most Romans were getting something directly from the government, free grain in particular. Aurelian decides to make the right to relief hereditary. Heretofore, it was, it's sort of a privilege. I mean, you get it because we decide to give it to you, but now it's enshrined in Roman law in 270 AD as if your parents got government aid, you now were entitled to it as a matter of right. And he added not only free grain, but free salt, free pork, free olive oil, other staples of the Roman diet, in an effort to buy the public support with the public's own money. And so the welfare state continues in that regard over the next couple of centuries. But it fuels an ongoing financial crisis. There's a great book that came out about 30 years ago called The Penniless Billionaires by Max Shapiro. And he talks about, has 4 chapters, each one is about a hyperinflation in the history of the world. And the first chapter is about the Roman hyperinflation of the 4th century, the 300s. This is with welfare state and foreign adventures now costing the treasury massive amounts. How do you pay for all that stuff? Well, actually, it was way back under Nero in the 50s AD that the Roman government started the process of debasing their coinage. They didn't have paper money, but Nero was the first, way back then. It just gathered steam under later emperors. He was the first to say, hey, we need more money. It's kind of hard to tax more and stay popular, and kind of hard to borrow more. Not many people will lend to us, so let's dilute the precious metal content of the coinage. So he called in the coins of the realm, melted them down. They once were 98% silver, but by 300 AD, the silver content of the Roman denarius had fallen to 0.02%. Just a speck. Just a fraction, just enough to say, well, we got a little bit in there, but there was actually virtually no silver content in it. And Shapiro in his book talks about the cyclonic superinflation of the 4th century that effectively destroyed the Roman currency. Wasn't much left of the economy at that point, and Rome limped along until in 476 AD. This once proud, strong, and free people actually in many cases welcomed foreign invaders, the Goths and the Visigoths, who entered Rome, pushed aside the last of the Roman emperors, and declared themselves the new authority. They welcomed the tyranny of foreign invasion because they thought anything's better than the tyranny of our own crowd right here. And Rome ceased to exist as a great civilization. Lots of lessons to be learned from that. I hope without delineating them specifically, you saw them. And if we have time, I'll take a few questions. Thank you.
you have a question, please? We'll start here.
The obvious question is, at what point are we now?
At what point are we now is the question. I always get that. And it's fun to speculate as to where we are. We're not in the empire phase. We don't have a dictator. We don't have the rather total erosion of personal character that you saw very late in the Republic and continuing into the empire. But I think we're in that last 100-year period, you might say. Now, I don't know that our experience is going to be only 100 years remaining of freedom and something awful to follow. I don't know. But we look like somewhere in the middle of that last century of the Roman Republic. In that, commitment to the Constitution has been greatly weakened. The size and the scope and the intrusiveness of the central government is vast and growing. That it seems like the major parties are both giving us ever more of it, even as one at least gives lip service to less of it. So I'd say we're late in that republic. But I also am optimistic. I don't want you to think that I think we're, if I wasn't, I wouldn't bother to come here and give this speech. I would say, well, I'd just give up and stay home and go along for the ride. But I think we'll turn this around. But how and when, I don't know. But all I know is you have good people who know what the right thing to do is. Continue to work for it, come hell or high water. Yes, sir. Jake.
Similar in vein to that last question, or at least what I could gather from your response, it's easy to bemoan kind of the erosion of cultural or constitutional norms when the other party's in power, but it's more difficult to do that when those same norms, constitutional or cultural, are being eroded, when you agree with some of the policies being offered. If there's any parallels between that experience in Rome and where we are, not just today with Trump, but you saw the other side do that with Obama 8 years ago, and conservatives or Republicans doing it with Bush, and right on down the line into the past of our recent history as well.
Yeah, it's appalling to see this over and over again, that people who sound great when they're out of power then become part of the problem when they're in power, and lose whatever courage they may have had to speak truth to power. And with regard to the current administration, I mean, it's a mixed bag. It's in some respects, like in deregulation, I think we've seen some great achievements, and choices for the courts have been fantastic. Certainly far better than we'd have gotten if the other person had won in 2016. That would have been unconscionable. But nonetheless, there have been some serious issues with Mr. Trump sometimes, who kind of flies by the seat of his pants. And I think he probably has good intentions, but I wish he understood the importance of the rule book a little more often. The Democrats sure don't. They don't care about it. But for instance, every time I hear him say something like something bad about a company because it decides it wants to locate in another country, we're going to stop that, or I'm thinking, oh my gosh, that's what a tyrant says. It's not your company. Hands off. So I don't like when I hear that. But even worse is when people don't speak out against that. We should tell all of our leaders all the time, do what you're tasked to do, and otherwise leave us alone. Stay out of our pockets and get off our backs.
Going back to Wilson and FDR and saying the American Republic has been in trouble since their presidencies, and we can argue which one is which. If you would go along with that premise, would it be fair to describe Donald Trump as our current day Marcus Aurelius?
Oh, is Donald Trump our current Marcus Aurelius? Well, that's an interesting question. If Marcus Aurelius had Twitter, I think I'd probably like what he would say on it more than I like what President Trump has to say. That's kind of a tough comparison. I mean, in some respects, Trump is a breath of fresh air, and Marcus Aurelius was too. After a string of lousy emperors, he briefly was one of the better ones. But he didn't stem the slide very long. And I just wonder about the staying power of even the good things that Mr. Trump is doing. But that's not so much a commentary on him as it is us. And what kind of a message will the American people send this November? Is it going to be a message of, hey, on the good things where you're cutting government, we want you to do more of that, and so we're going to elect those kind of people? Or is it going to be, as some are predicting now, a wave or a backlash? Are we going to send people to Washington who want to undo the good things that he's done? I don't know. That will tell us a lot, I think, about where we are as a people. I would caution you to be careful about drawing parallels too closely, because every age, every people are unique. They're different. And the right combination of unpredictable events and personalities and ideas can push things in a remarkably better direction unexpectedly. So I keep hoping for that and working for it. So we should learn from what Rome did, but be careful not to say, dollar for dollar, we're on precisely the same path. We can change things.
One thing that teachers these days will teach in history class is that Rome reached its military peak under Trajan just after 100 AD, and its economic peak under Marcus Aurelius a few decades later. And obviously by that time, a lot of the constitutional norms had been eroded entirely, the Republic was dead, and government had grown dramatically. So what would you say to people who would argue that Imperial Rome was a greater nation than the Roman Republic, at least in the first century or so?
There's a kernel of truth to that. I mean, it was a greater nation, you might say, in terms of the expanse that it governed. Its armies went further than those of the Republic. Its reach stretched from Scotland to Persia. They extended Rome's influence. But if you measure the greatness of a civilization not by the extent of its military or the power of its dictators, but rather the freedom of its people, that's definitely 100 or 200 years before Trajan. So yeah, there was some forward momentum. And I mean, just as there was, say, there are a lot of people who say, well, the first couple of years of Hitler in Germany weren't so bad. And look what happened a few years later. He took over all of Europe. Well, yeah, but that didn't last. And so you might say the Nazi Germany reached its peak well into the Hitler years, but not if you measure the greatness of that society by the liberties of its people. So what's more important to you, military conquest and dictatorship or individual liberty?
How does character play in keeping our liberties?
What's that?
How important is character in keeping our liberties?
Oh, what part does character play in keeping our liberties? Oh, it's absolutely critical, indispensable. They're two sides of the same coin. This is something we stress at FEE a great deal, that liberty and character are two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. I know of no civilization in all of history that didn't rise to true greatness without a substantial measure of character. And I know of no civilization that lost its character and kept its liberties. None. No exception to that. And liberty is the one system, I might say. In fact, this is the subject tonight, so I don't want to get into too much detail, but liberty is the only social, political, economic arrangement that requires that we live to high standards of character. The only one. You could be a dirtbag and fit right into a socialist environment. You'll be right at home. But if you want to be free, you've got to be a person of character, and lots of other people have to be too.
Larry Reed.
Hey, thank you. Thank you very much.